Hello, and welcome to this episode of Spotlight on the Divorce Experts. Today, I have a special guest that I am so happy to have on. I have been following her for a long time on LinkedIn. We've chatted several times and just never had a chance to talk. I want to talk on a recording, and I want to talk today with Victoria Kirilloff. She is an amazing individual. She is a CDFA, NCPM, which we're going to ask her to explain what that one is, and a CDS. Now, I know what that one is because I'm also one. But she really helps people go through divorce and really know their numbers, but also understand the short and long-term implications of some of the financial decisions that we are required to make during divorce, even though we're at our most stressed time in life. So Victoria has gone through her own toxic relationship and getting out of that situation. She may want to touch on that a little bit, but she really used her expertise and her financial background to be able to create what she has now created as the Global Settlement Proposal, which I have seen a copy of that, and they are amazing. So I want her to talk about that. And I want you to talk a little bit about your company, Victoria, Divorce Analytics, and how she really helps people focus on the financial facts to have a really empowered settlement. So, Victoria, after all of that, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Marty. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Well, and I want to really thank you because you're actually coming in today internationally, so that makes it even better. So, Victoria, if you don't mind, tell us a little bit about your background and how you created that idea of a global settlement proposal. And then we're going to go into more specifics about that and the benefits it offers and all of the good stuff.
Yeah. Well, necessity is the mother of invention. And I am 38 years old right now, but when I was 20, I had fallen in love with my college sweetheart, and we had a very toxic relationship. And I was with him a third of my total adult life, or my entire life. And so I realized that halfway through the relationship, things were not going well. And he was a man child, and God bless him, but it was not a right fit. And I had a lot of toxic beliefs that I held. And I thought if I just worked harder, if I self-sacrificed more, if I bent over backwards further and broke my back, maybe he would come around. And it created this horrible push-pull dynamic, which a lot of people find themselves in. And it wasn't until there was a pretty serious domestic violence incident that I realized that I needed to get out. However, for the first time in my life, I was facing a big adult decision without my 900-pound Russian gorilla father in the room. My daddy, who's no longer with us, was a brilliant nuclear engineer that worked for the government during the Cold War and always was teaching me how to be a numerical communicator. He would always say, "Kid, if it cannot be expressed in numbers, it cannot be expressed at all." And that was a lesson that was taught to me day in and day out. It started when I was 8 years old and I wanted a pony. I wore him down and he said, "Okay, why don't you build out a life cycle cost analysis? Because I'm pretty sure the cost of the horse is just the icing on the cake. And we need to figure out all of those other costs that are associated with him." So I was able to go around to the barns and I took all the information and I built out what became my first financial report. And I was able, using all of the financial facts, to really articulate what I wanted, because crying and screaming and begging and pleading didn't work. I tried all of that. But it was only when I was able to replace those overwhelming emotions with financial facts that my parents then ended up, moving off of that spot of no, and that no became a yes, and Buster came home with us.
Yay!
So, yeah. And so it was just a wonderful life lesson that my dad taught me. And so fast forward to my uncoupling with Voldemort, I realized that I was stuck, right? I loved the house that I had built, or I'd bought us, and it was a fantastic life from the outside, but I was absolutely miserable and I was dying on the inside. And it was hard. I love America, but a lot of our emphasis is put on the pretty picture. And it was very hard for me to look at the long list of paper accomplishments we had as a couple and reconcile that with the reality. And I had trapped myself inadvertently in our marital mausoleum, our house, and I had poured all of my energy into the house, and I I painted, I scraped off wallpaper, I repainted hallways, the whole thing. I mean, it was where I had put all of my labor of love, because putting it towards Voldemort it was not helpful. It was only making things worse, and I didn't know where to go. So after the domestic violence incident, I realized that I needed to look through things through the financial lens. I was so emotionally overwhelmed. I didn't even know there was something called a divorce coach back then. But I knew that I had my mantra etched on my heart. And I simply sat down and I started figuring out the cash flow implications, what it would take to keep the house. And it was a massive property that you'd have to spend all weekend long if you didn't have a yard crew cleaning the grounds up. And as I was going through my own transformation, building out my own business, I didn't have it in me anymore to put all of that energy towards it. So I realized through the financials, I actually didn't want the house. And I then started figuring out what the total marital estate value was of everything we accumulated together. And then I drafted a property division proposal. Everything was backstopped with documentation. Now, this is just something in my household with a bunch of engineers. That was just common protocol.
Sure, makes
Well,
sense. Yeah.
right? Yeah. Well, in divorce, it is not. But I didn't even know I was helping myself out back then. But it enabled me really to put everything together into an easily readable report that could then be verified by whoever was glancing through it. And it was kind of like kryptonite. I was able to sit at my kitchen table with Voldemort, and within 20 minutes, he'd gone through, checked my work, and he went with option A, which was to sell the house and split everything. And so it was like when a light bulb went off, and I said, aha, like the marriage might be miserable, but the divorce does not have to be. And
Yes.
that was the beginning of divorce analytics. And here
Yeah.
we are 8 years later.
And I think it's so powerful. And I really want to stress this. Most women and most men um, could not do this on their own because they don't
Yeah.
have the financial background. They don't even, I don't understand how to do that report. And I've been in the divorce industry for almost 30 years, but the finances are just not my thing. I mean, I've been a
Mhm.
mediator, I've been a divorce coach, I've been a domestic violence client advocate, walking clients through the divorce process with an attorney, but I have absolutely never dealt with the finances. And I mean, I can do a basic budget with my clients. I can help them gather the documents. But what you really do is take all of that information and put it into this report that lays out the options. And can you talk a
Yes.
little bit more about what is contained in that report and why this is so important to have this before you start talking to your attorney about anything that you want or don't want in the divorce settlement?
Absolutely. So, to begin with, I am a believer that divorce is really a four-phase event. There is an emotional, social, financial, and legal phase. Now, to really do this effectively, you need to break it down and work with the right professional at the right time. A divorce coach comes into play with the emotional and social phase, but where rubber really starts to hit the road and this becomes a business operation is in the financial phase. That's when you work with someone like myself, a certified divorce financial analyst, to build out the global settlement proposal. So then when you do start to negotiate, you know what you're talking about. I cannot stress it enough. Divorce is an order of operations event. Now, the phases do not, you don't complete one and then go to the other. They blend. But if you do not know your financial facts and if you do not have good emotional regulation, you are not going to be able to enter into the legal phase in a cost effective or highly controlled way. Now, divorce is going to be a rough experience just by nature, but there are ways to make it more improved and to give yourself a higher quality of experience. And that really goes into knowing your financial data. Now, doing a budget is like the least sexy thing.
It is. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but it is truly where all of your power lies. I have clients that are 2 to 3 years in the divorce process, and I ask them for a budget, and they give me a
Yeah.
very basic estimation, and I'm like, oh hell no, this is
Yeah.
bad. Like, because if you don't have your cash flow considerations understood, how are you ever going to know how much money you need for spousal support? Or, if your ex is proposing what looks like a good settlement on paper, well, you need to be able to verify what your future life expectations are.
Right.
Otherwise, they could be offering you $10 million. If your expenses are 20 million, it's a bad deal.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
And I think that's something that I see quite often, Victoria, is I see a spouse, particularly the spouse that controls the money. And that's very common in a relationship. And sometimes that's financial abuse. And sometimes that's just the way life goes. Like I know in
yeah,
my first marriage, I did all the financial stuff because my partner didn't want anything to do with it. But he, at any point in time, we could talk about finances. He had all the access to the books. So you have to be aware of that situation, because if you are in the financial abuse situation, you may not
hmm,
know anything about the money, and
yeah,
you may be told you don't have access, and you may find out that you are not on any account and you're not going to be able to get that information. But at least you can find out where the institutes are, where the accounts are, if you're a little bit of a detective. And that's where you can kind of guide people, right? Where to look for
yeah.
this information. And I know there was something else I was going to say there, but I think it is, like you said, I really love the idea of making sure that you include everything in your budget. That's where I was going, because I have seen
Mhm.
cases where the typically, because I work with women mostly, where the woman has left the relationship. She's gone maybe to live with her parents, or maybe a sister, or maybe a friend. So right now she's not paying rent. So when she does
Yes.
her budget, she doesn't include rent, because in her head,
Yeah.
she's not paying rent. But when if you're living in LA and your rent is going to be $3,000 a month, you better have that in your budget when you submit it to your legal team. That's the kind of stuff you're
Absolutely.
talking about that can so easily get overlooked, right?
Well, yes, and I can't tell you, it makes my blood boil, but for some freaking reason, attorneys do not jump on emergency spousal support orders when they need to. Generally, there tends to be some custody issues or something that's a little bit more pressing from their perspective. But from most of my clients, who tend to be women as well, but I also have stay-at-home dads who have given
Yeah,
up
sure.
everything, and
Sure.
now they're, having to rebuild. And so, you know, getting emergency spousal support is going to be one of the most important things if you are coming from a financially disadvantaged position, whether that's through financial abuse or if that's just how the operations of the marriage worked. And, I think the more that you actually understand your cash flow data and you have it broke out, it becomes that much more harder for them to push back and refute.
Right.
I see it oftentimes. I'm working on this case right now where they live in Southern California, and their cost of living as a married couple was around $55,000 a month. She ended up with like a $4,000 allowance or whatever, but then all of the other credit cards were paid for by her ex. And so in his mind, and keep in mind, this guy makes 100,000 a month. He thinks she should be more than enough satisfied with $4,000 in support because that's what her allowance was.
Right.
So, it's years of gaslighting, bad family financial narratives that were spoken to existence during the marriage for a control tactic, or just, maybe through sheer ignorance and miseducation. But that is really my job to go through and break apart.
Right.
So many people have been told that your money is my money and my money is my money, and
Yes. Yeah.
never shall the two meet. And that is 100% false. Depending on what state you're in, it's either an equitable distribution, which is what's fair, maybe not equal, or a community property distribution, which is 50-50.
Right.
Well, there's so many different caveats to that. I won't go into the details of a willful dissipation of marital funds claim, but for the most part, you have to figure out what that total marital estate value is and what any separate property interest would be.
Right.
So the more that you can go back to supporting documentation to guide this process, it is really going to make short work of everything else.
Right. And I think, so I am in a community property state. I think there's only 9 of them now in the United
Mm-hmm.
States. But whether it's community property or equitable distribution, in most cases, it's going to be, the gold standard would be that 50-50. But I don't know any
Yeah.
case that it's ever 50-50 because there are some things that are excluded from that. Like if you have an insurance, like if you get paid insurance money, that's typically not considered community property unless you commingle funds. And that's a whole nother thing, right? Where you actually like if I owned a house prior to the marriage, even in a 50-50 state, that's separate property.
Yeah.
But if the spouse then pays repairs on that home and is contributing to the mortgage on that home or the insurance payment on that home, now they have equity in the home, right? So there's
Yeah.
there's all these things that people don't understand. And that's another topic. Maybe one day we have to talk about that is if you're going to go into a relationship and you have some assets, how can you
Mm-hmm.
protect those assets, even if you don't want to do a prenup or a postnup, which I believe everybody should do, even if you were the best of friends and never think there's going to be a divorce. I just think it's a nice thing to do. But anyhow,
Yeah.
I get off track on that one. But you really help people identify those things. What do you see
Mm-hmm.
as some of the common maybe mistakes or misunderstandings? I know that one of the big ones is that what's mine is mine and what's yours is mine because I said it
Mm-hmm.
is. I get that. What are some of the other big mistakes that you see your clients coming in with or big misunderstandings?
I would say the budget. It is probably the one thing that is overlooked the most, that has the most amount of power to get you what you want. Um, you really need to be able to create a report that stands on its own without you. I think that's something that we often, like, clients don't realize, right? You're probably not going to be in the room negotiating with your partner. It's going to either be through a mediator or it's going to be, through attorneys, hopefully not a judge. But at the end of the day, the divorce process is always dictated by how well you guys can communicate together. And it's when that there's a lack of financial transparency and a lack of the different financial issues for resolution. That's when people have a tendency to have to then increase the negotiating power and wind up with bulldog attorneys that are not really productively moving the ball forward.
Right.
But definitely the budget is one of the most important things. Another thing is that not all assets are created equal. That is a huge issue that I see, especially with spouses that are a little financially unsure, and their husband or wife comes to them and says like, "Hey, I'm going to I put together a deal trying to save us money. Well, let's, save on attorney's fees, but oh, by the way, I snuck a few bombs in here that you're not going to be able to tell unless you get outside help." So generally what that looks like is that someone will offer $100,000 of the 401k for you to take, and then they're going to retain the $100,000 IRA Roth account. And so a Roth account is funded with post-tax dollars. So that's
Right.
like, straight off, the account balance is what the valuation is. However, with a traditional IRA or a 401k or a 403b or a 457b, all of those qualified retirement plans are funded with
Pre-tax.
pre-tax dollars.
Right.
So that 100 is actually like they're going to keep 100. You're going to have to pay your ordinary income tax on that distribution. So it's actually 70,000.
Right.
So there's little things that on paper can look very deceiving, and you always need to be blending in what the tax implications are of the event.
So thank you for pointing that out. That's something I think that, I always kind of gloss over that, but I really appreciate you saying that. I think the other thing that I see is people who see the house as the biggest asset and they take it.
Yes.
Now, whether they can qualify for the mortgage, a lot of people just assume, well, I'll just assume the mortgage. No, that doesn't happen. You have to qualify, and your spousal support payments have to be in place for, I think, typically 6 months before they can qualify as income. So you may have an
Yeah.
income gap where you can't. Now, I have seen some very creative settlements where the spouse, the moneyed spouse, agrees to continue to pay the mortgage until the 6 month time, at which time there is enough qualified income for. So there's, if your spouse is willing to work with you, you can do these things. But
Hmm.
I always say that house, yes, it is an asset, but it's also, a money pit, just like that old movie, right?
Yes.
Because it's going to need a roof. It's going to need
Hmm.
maybe plumbing repairs. It might need some foundation work. So you have to look at, really, is it a good investment? And that entirely depends on where you're at. And that's why I love what you do. And I think that this is why I think that 4-phase or that 4-stage of divorce is so important, because you have to have your financial ducks in a row before you go talk to your attorney, because your attorney is going to most typically give you the standard information, get the biggest asset, which is the house, and
Hmm.
I've seen situations where very well-known attorneys have talked their clients into taking the house, and then the client can't qualify for the mortgage. And the attorney goes,
Oh
well,
my
didn't you check
God.
that out? Like, no, because you
Yeah,
tell me
didn't
to do
you
that.
check that out? Yeah, exactly. And I think that just is a beautiful segue into letting our listeners know that your attorney is not trained in personal finance in law school, right? Like, I am originally a wealth manager. I was a financial advisor that then further specialized as a divorce analyst after I had my own events. But this is not something that most divorce professionals are trained in. You know, finance is a beast onto its own, and there's so many little nuances. And even how you mentioned, some mortgages have an assumption option, which will enable you to preserve that lower interest rate and potentially take your spouse off of the note. However, a lot of mortgages aren't like that. They don't even give you that option. So
Right.
what that means is you have to go through the full-blown underwriting process. And another event that you have to consider as a part of your mortgage analysis is your debt to income ratio.
Right.
And that becomes there's so many little gates that you have to go through and make sure that you can properly fit. Otherwise, what ends up happening is that you spend $100,000 fighting for an asset that you're going to have to turn around and then sell.
And then if
So,
you're single when you sell, you're going to take the capital gains hit of
mhm.
500,000 instead of the 250. So there's all of these things that that can quickly turn what looks like a really good divorce settlement into something that's not good. And I just want to point out too,
Absolutely.
Victoria, that you are so right. There are a handful of attorneys that also are a certified divorce financial analyst, or they're
Mhm.
CDF or a certified financial planner, or they have some financial expertise, but there are very few. And that's
Mhm.
not a knock on the attorneys. That's not what they're there to do. They're not there to be your financial
Exactly.
specialist. They're there to be your legal specialist. But again, having the financial ducks in a row before you go to the attorney, I think, is one of the biggest cost saving things
Oh
that
yeah.
you can do. Yeah. And having that report, even if you're doing this pro se without attorneys,
Mhm.
if you have that report when you go to mediation, now, instead of just the two of you batting around ideas and the mediator going, because mediators can't provide advice either. So all they could do is kind of sit there and try to facilitate the communication.
Mhm.
But if you have a concrete document that you can refer to, you are so much stronger going into that room.
Yeah. Well, this is your divorce process, right? Like you need to know what you want out of this. And
Right.
that's really where working with a coach like you comes into play, right? Clients need to understand that the burden is on them to build out what they would like out of the
Right.
marital asset pot. And,
Right.
it is not the most fun activity, but is truly the key to the rest of your life. Because as you mentioned, if you don't have a firm document to then trace back and keep the conversation tied to, what ends up happening is that the couple will just go round and round in circles during their negotiation, and they'll blow 50, 60, $100,000. I've even been on cases that have been 5 years, a
Yeah.
couple million, and
Yeah.
they still don't have a global settlement proposal. And it just becomes very, very challenging to keep track of all of these moving parts.
Right.
And I'm a super nerd. And so I make it very easy. I, keep it to a one-page document, a spreadsheet that everyone could quickly reference. Like, okay, we have the total marital estate value. Here's all the different assets. Here are the other issues that we need to resolve, like spousal support, any, money spent on post-separation cost of living from the marital pot. Like all of that needs to be reconciled. And really, they go together.
Right.
In my mind, you always need to figure out if you're going to be paying spousal support in a lump sum or on a monthly basis. And with that, then you need to be able to figure out how, if you're doing that lump sum, how is it going to be funded?
Right.
So all of this goes cohesively together within that marital balance sheet. So you can actually show up to mediation like a rock star, or, eventually, hopefully you don't have to go to court, but
Right.
everything that I do is rooted in the legal system. And so we are trying to keep things amicable. But if things do take a turn south, all of the documentation is there for your attorney and the judge to step right into the shoes, check my work, and move forward.
Yeah. Wonderful. And you brought up something that I'd like to just touch on. We're almost out of time, but this is such an important thing. Now, how is spousal support typically calculated? And I know it is different based on
Hmm.
some areas have formulas, some areas it's case
Yeah.
by case, but typically, how is spousal support established or determined?
Good qualifying point. It will definitely depend on your state's laws, but really, for the most part, it does boil down to the top four legs of the spousal support stool. That is the marital standard of living, your post divorce cost of living, the payor's income available for support, and the recipient's earning capacity. So the marital standard of living is exactly what it is. How much money was the couple pulling in and what was their lifestyle during the marriage? Then you have to start projecting forward their post-divorce cost of living, keeping in mind that everything from your housing to your insurance to, not only your health, but your car insurance is going to change. And you probably are on a family policy currently, so that's going to increase when you lose that deduction or savings mechanism. Same thing with your health or your car insurance. So you really need to go through that mighty budget and figure out all of those little nuanced costs, because when we start looking at the third for support, this is where we have to look through the income taxation lens. When you guys get married, Uncle Sam gives you the best gift he's ever going to, and that is that marital tax status.
Right.
So that means your tax burden is reduced when you are married. However, when you're not married, you either are single or head of household. Head of household is when you have a dependent, one or more living with you. And that gives you a little bit of a break. And then single is going to be the most expensive.
Yes.
So it ranges from a few hundred to a few thousands of dollars each month that Uncle Sam will continue to pull out. So
Right.
not only do you have less money coming in, you now have more expenses. And that's really where looking through that financial lens at the income available for support is so important. Conversely, when we look at the final leg of the spousal support stool, the recipient's earning capacity, this can cause a lot of people some anxiety, because they're like, well, I haven't been working, and I've been married for 25 years. I raised the kids, and now, am I supposed to go make $150,000 to support my lifestyle? No, that's not what this is about. What the income, what actually figuring out the earning capacity of the recipient, this can be a very nuanced process ranging kind of based off of the degree of contention within the divorce. If everyone is very amicable, it could be figuring out like, just a quick calculation. Okay, so, you need to go back to school to get your nursing degree. It's going to cost, X, Y, and Z dollars. And then you build all of those financial responsibilities to bolster that person's earning capacity into the spousal support calculation.
Right. Right.
If you are more adversarial, you'll go through a full-blown vocational assessment, which, I think I would hope that there'd be a little bit more
Compassion in some of those. Yeah.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
they can be really sketchy.
They can't be. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And so what normally happens is some type of career coach will go through and value your skills and go on LinkedIn or Indeed or some type of monster job posting platform and gather a variety of jobs that they believe that you'd be qualified for.
Right.
Now, it can, be wildly inaccurate. And
Right.
so
Right.
it really, this is not meant to be a tool to punish that person that gave up their earning capacity for the family. This really needs to be looked through the lens of, okay, this person, if they got this accreditation, they could be pulling in X more amount of dollars and, using education as a form of empowerment.
Right.
And spousal support, there's a variety of different ways that it gets paid. But for the most part, a lot of jurisdictions are moving away from permanent support and they want to see some type of rehabilitative process.
Right.
So
right.
That's really where we build it in. Okay, this is what the earning capacity maximization financial requirements are, and it's going to take, let's say, 5 years. So the spousal support payment will be 100% during those 5 years.
Right.
And then, we'll build in a stair-step mechanism.
Step down. Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Yep. So as that person's earning capacity does increase, the payor does see that there's light at the end of the tunnel. And that's like, oh my gosh, I love doing spousal support calculations because it really tends to be one of the more contentious parts of the divorce if you're only going through that emotional or social lens.
Right.
But when you start putting all of the variables together, you're able then to really shift that conversation, very similar to me, begging my parents for the horse, not successfully, and then being like, okay, we'll swap out ballet for, hay. But when you are communicating with your ex-spouse and their legal counsel through financially prudent lenses, it becomes even harder for them to push back.
Right. Right. I really appreciate that. And I also want to highlight what Victoria said is that the idea of permanent spousal support, especially if you are a younger individual, whether you're a man or a woman, if you are younger, and I'm going to say like 60 and under, or, in some cases, depending on what your qualifications may have been. I mean, I have people who, that whole spousal support thing, quite often the person that is required to pay feels very angry. That just kind of keeps the anger going. And I mean, I get that perspective. Like, it's like, especially if the partner is the one that filed for divorce, and now you didn't want the divorce in the first place, and now you're going to be paying for 10 years for them to live their best life. And you can see where the anger comes out because you're thinking, my marriage was my best life, or my marriage was okay. Let's put it that way. So, you can see why that spousal support is a bittersweet thing I think for both parties. And personally, I have the opinion that getting out on your own and not being dependent on your ex-spouse is a very empowering thing to do. But permanent spousal support is still available if you have some kind of a physical health condition or a mental health condition, or you are perhaps a caregiver for an adult disabled child, and you're going to be forever, for your life. So there are cases that come in here where permanent alimony is, or spousal support is offered, but they're very rare. Most cases now, it's typically, most states, don't they use half the length of the marriage?
Yeah, half to 75%.
Yeah. So if you've been married for
And
14 years, you can expect 7 to 10 years support, with 10 being, usually that's going to be a step down system if it's like that, right?
oh, definitely.
Yeah.
I think another important thing to highlight is, depending on your state, if you engage in adultery, then you waive your right to spousal support.
Right.
So that's
Yeah.
something else to just kind of keep in mind.
And this is something else that I just found out. And I believe it's California, but I could be wrong. So please don't, it may not be California. I'm just putting that out there. And we are not providing legal or financial advice on this episode, just to throw that little reminder out there as well, since we're getting into some nitty gritty here. But there are some states where, yes, if you remarry, obviously spousal support stops. If either one of the parties to the divorce passes away, the spousal support stops. But there are some states now where, even if you are in a relationship, even if you're not in a cohabiting relationship, but you have a partner who is financially supporting you in some way. So I have heard of situations where people have chosen not to live together because they're aware that would end the spousal support, but the partner has paid the ex-spouse's, or the new partner has paid the ex-spouse's apartment costs, say. That in some states, that will terminate that spousal support. Yeah. So you really need to know, and maybe that's a good thing, I don't know, but you do need to know the laws, and it's worthwhile doing some research. You can go on your state website, you can go under the family code and read what the criteria is. So Victoria, you have shared so much today. Is there anything you wanted to share that we haven't covered yet?
I think the most important thing I would like to share with your followers is the message that your marriage might have been miserable, but your divorce can be a remarkably healing process. It does not have to continue the same toxic cycle, but if you have the right team of a divorce coach, an analyst, and a great attorney that's empowering you, this can be a healing and transformative journey, and it can lead you to your most authentic version. And there's going to be uncomfortable emotions that arise, but it's okay. Life it sucks and it can be hard, but the most amazing thing about being a human being is the amount of resilience that we all have. And this is a wonderful opportunity to tap into your internal fire and really claim the life that you love.
Oh, what a positive way to end this. I love that. Victoria, if people want to reach out, if they want to work with you or find out more about what you do, what's the best way to do that?
I would suggest visiting my website, divorceanalytics.com. I offer free 30-minute consultations. My whole role in this process is to help people make data-driven decisions. I know what it's like to be on the opposite side of the table, what it's like to wake up at 3 a.m. terrified because you can't keep sleeping next to them, but you don't know where else your bed's going to be. And I really I feel so fortunate to be able to take all of the hard things that I have lived through and to share my experience and my journey with others. So I recommend that you, schedule a consultation or follow me on social media. You can also check out my Instagram page at Divorce Analytics. I'm pretty much everywhere these days.
Yeah, and I've got to say, Victoria is very active on the social media platforms, and she does respond to questions, and she provides some amazing insights. And get on her newsletter. I'm telling you, they come out and it is a wealth of information. So please connect with Victoria. And if you're going through a divorce, or even if you're just concerned about like your financial future, even if you're in maybe a healthy marriage and you're thinking, I don't know anything about my finances, she gives a whole bunch of tips and ideas and strategies. So definitely get on her newsletter list. Victoria, thank you so much for being here and taking your time, and just for sharing all this really important information for people to know.
It was a pleasure to be here, Marty. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, and thank you everyone for listening in to this episode of Spotlight on the Divorce Experts. And don't forget to tune in for our next episode.